Thank you to the Heartland Institute. Thank you to the Competitive Enterprise Institute. Thank you to the Committee for a Constructive Tomorrow. And thank you also to the Europäisches Institut für Klima und Energie. All of them have contributed so much to this conference. And what a valuable conference it is. You look across the road and up at Le Bourget, the private airfield, where Mr. Gore's plane can fly in, his Gulfstream 5, I understand it was, one of the most CO2 emitting planes on the planet. That's how he arrived, to tell us we must live in poverty. Well, they have the money, the power and the glory, but we here have the truth.
Yeah.
So they have nothing, and we have everything. And in 50 years' time, when historians come to look back on this strange episode, this weird aberration, they will see that those who have gone in their tens of thousands to the other conference achieved nothing except the deaths of several tens of millions every year. And we have achieved everything by keeping the truth alive. You will have heard today from speaker after speaker, thoughtful, considered, carefully costed, mathematics and physics. You have not heard political propaganda. You have just heard straightforward science, straightforward economics, and straightforward common sense. Because we owe it to those less fortunate than ourselves that we should not indulge ourselves in bad science, bogus economics, but instead we should hold fast to the truth. There is no greater corruption than that form of corruption which tells lies and in doing so kills those who are most defenseless. Free speech is one of the casualties. You've all heard of Philippe Verdier, who was France's leading weatherman on the main TV channels. And shortly before the Paris conference, he was dismissed. Was it because he was a bad weatherman? If he was, of course, he could go straight to the Met Office and get a job. He was dismissed because he was a good weatherman, and he wrote a remarkably good book investigating whether we had a problem with the climate, as everyone was suggesting. Merely for asking that question, seeking the inconvenient truth, he was dismissed. But I am glad to report that he now has a job with Russia Today as a weatherman, where he will reach a far larger audience than ever he reached on French TV. Shall we give him a round of applause? He would have come to this conference had it not been for his new job. Now I'm going to start by looking at what we want from the Paris conference. And first of all, we would like to see, these are the full democratic provisions, I've listed them most carefully, that you will find in the draft Paris Agreement. It took me ages to type them all out. And it is dangerous when every time we establish among the nations a supranational and now increasingly a global body, we do not make sure that that body is elected by the peoples of the states parties to the treaty or agreement concerned. There are no democratic provisions of any kind, anywhere in the 50 pages or so of mostly square brackets in this treaty draft. None whatsoever. And to those of us who were raised in freedom and were raised to love democracy and to be grateful to those who came before us and fought for it so that we could live in freedom, this is a grievous concern. So I raise it with you now because one of the things that we would like to see here in this conference is that if we are to have international agreements where real political power, decision-making power, legislative power, financial power, and wealth are transferred from elected hands in those countries lucky enough to have them to unelected hands somewhere else. That's not acceptable. In future, such transfers must be from elected hands to elected hands, or there should be no transfers at all. Next, we want a secession clause. I'm glad to say that although this clause was not included in the first draft of February this year of the Paris Agreement, after a certain amount of manoeuvring round the back, we have managed to get a secession clause inserted into the second, third, and now fourth draft. It is still there in the current draft. I checked yesterday. And what it says is that at any time after 3 years from the date on which this agreement is entered into force for a party, that party may withdraw 1 year after having given notice to the depository state, which in this case is Paris. So this allows nations who gradually, one by one, realise, as Canada did under Stephen Harper, its late Prime Minister, that this climate scam is not a good idea. They can simply resile from the treaty process, as he resiled from the Kyoto Protocol, without any penalty whatsoever. Now that is a very essential clause, because what it does is it prevents them from creating a permanent world government into which the member states are locked with no method of escape, even after it has become apparent to all of them that the proposition on the basis of which they agreed to this agreement was in fact largely fraudulent. So it gives them the right to escape, and that means that the bureaucracy at the centre of this will always know that if it pushes the truth too far in future, it will drive member states out of the agreement it has spent so much of its time and our money putting in place. We also would like to see a judicial inquiry clause. And the purpose of this clause is to make sure that the absence of debate, which is not our fault, but it is their fault, is remedied. One of the best ways of getting at the truth, even of a scientific question, where there is a dispute and where one side, knowing it is in the wrong, is reluctant to debate, is to say to both parties, put your best foot forward. We will invite testimony from all over the world, and at The Hague, you use the court there perhaps, and they say that on a certain date the hearings will begin. In the meantime, anyone who wants can submit evidence, and then they will be called and they can give testimony, but they will be cross-examined by the other side. We, on this side of the debate, are very willing to face such cross-examination, because, as must be apparent to you by now from the very distinguished programme this morning and this afternoon, we on this side of the House have done our homework, we've done our maths, we know what we're talking about, and we're happy to defend it against cross-examination. But they are not. So let us have a judicial inquiry clause just to review whether or not these conferences are still going in the right direction, given some of the facts that you've already seen and some that I shall show you later on. We also want a sunset clause. And this simply says that if in any 20-year period over the 21st century there shall have been less than roughly a sixth of a Celsius degree of warming, which is well below even the lowest amount that they're predicting, the entire ghastly process comes to an end, every body and structure created under that process comes to an end, and there will be no more of these dismal, miserable annual conferences. Are you all in agreement? What to do with the money instead? Well, you have heard three of the best presentations I have ever heard on the energy question. You've heard from Patrick Moore just how little the Greens would allow electricity to be generated at all. They seem to hate just about every form of electricity generation, and the only ones they seem to favour are the ones like wind that do the maximum environmental damage, and not merely just by destroying the landscape, but also by killing rare birds. This is a huge problem for us in Scotland. It's a huge problem in Spain, where campaigners have managed to get several large wind farms closed down before they killed all the rare birds in a particular region. And so that's a huge problem. But what to do with the money instead? Well, as you have heard, particularly from Nick Lorris, we should spend the money on making sure that Africa, India, China, and South America get electricity, and I mean baseload, continuous, reliable, cheap, coal-fired, clean electricity to every village and every home. We take this for granted, and it is not acceptable to us that these people should be told, well, as the Professor of Physics said to us when I attended a seminar at the Mathematics Department at my old university, Cambridge, just a couple of weeks ago, he said, we're going to give a solar panel and a battery to every hut in Africa so that they can read at night. Well, gee, wow, golly gosh, how patronising is that, Professor? What we in this room would give them, and we'd be able to give it to them with a tiny fraction of the $1 billion a day now being squandered on using 14th century technology of windmills to address a 21st century non-problem. A tiny fraction of that expenditure, we could provide proper, continuous, baseload, affordable, coal-fired power to everywhere in Africa and China and South America and everywhere that hasn't got electricity. Because when you measure an opportunity loss, which is what this is in economic terms, in human lives, and not just a few, but in the tens of millions every year, that is how very serious this matter is. Why do I say tens of millions of lives every year? The life expectancy of the average person living in a country that doesn't have electricity for the general population is somewhere between 35 and 40 years. The average life expectancy of somebody in a country that does have electricity is between 85 and 90 years. So your lifespan is dramatically shortened if you don't have electricity. One of the pieces of research I'm going to do for my next scientific paper is just what is the cost in human lives of denying to the people of the dark continent, dark in every sense, just look at that map, the electricity that they need in order to live. But the opportunity loss isn't only in human lives. That, to any rational and humane person, would be enough. You heard Senator Inhofe in that brilliant presentation in which he packed so much into his 8 minutes. You heard him end by saying that we here are doing the Lord's work. We are doing the right thing by standing up and speaking out for those who don't have electricity. They don't also have clean water supply, because you need electricity to run the system. So we need to make sure that they have clean water supply. The planet is covered in water to a depth of several miles. It's not as though we're short of the stuff. It can be easily desalinated these days and pumped to where it's needed. And then we need clean sewerage for them to dispose of it safely when they've used it. They also need public health measures to control infectious disease. We have largely eradicated infectious disease as a killer in the West. It is still the biggest killer in the third world country. And they also need education, because once they have education, they don't need to depend on us for any of these things, because they will be bright enough to do these for themselves. Those are the big needs. The UN knows they are the big needs. The UN has even costed what it would cost the planet to provide them with all those needs, all these basic requirements that we take for granted. And the cost of that, according to the UN, is $75 billion a year. But at the moment, the climate scam is costing the taxpayers of the West more like $1 billion a day, getting on for $400 billion a year. That money is being squandered on transferring wealth from the poor, as was said earlier, to the rich. It's supposed to be the other way around. The opportunity loss is worse than that too, because here are people who are struggling merely to survive from day to day. If they have to fetch water, they might have to walk half the day there to get it, half the day to get it back, just to give their children something to drink. These people could be doing productive work, just as we are fortunate to be able to do. All that is lost to the global economy. And let it not be thought that this is a problem which extends way beyond somewhere in the countries where we know nothing. Far away countries of which we know little, as Chamberlain once said of Czechoslovakia. Goodness knows, that's close enough to. And it's easy enough to say, well, Africa's a long way away and India's still further, and as for China, we've never really heard of what goes on in there. The fact is that if we remain prosperous and we deny them the basic means of becoming prosperous like us, they will eventually begin to migrate. And you may have noticed that this is already happening, and happening in very large numbers. You've just heard from Wolfgang how this is happening. Millions coming in now, and most of them are young men in their 20s. They are economic migrants. They despair of ever living decently anywhere in their own countries. And they come to our own countries here because they see our streets, compared with theirs, as paved with gold and not with mud. And these people desperately need the chance to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. The very fact that they are willing to dislocate themselves and travel so far and pay so much to the traffickers who ship them into Europe. The fact that they're willing to undergo the expense and the risk even to their lives to make that journey tells us all we need to know about how, if we wish to preserve our own prosperity, then it is time we looked a little more carefully at creating theirs. So we here at this conference speak for the poor people of the world. We speak for the huge economic opportunity that will accrue to the planet as a whole if we do what no previous generation could have done. And that is what the other conference at the private airfield should be doing. It should be saying that now, for the first time, we can eradicate poverty altogether from our planet. It no longer needs to exist anywhere. We know from our audits of natural resources, we know from the state of the climate, we know where we stand. We know that we can now eradicate poverty. Never again need anyone have to worry about where the next square meal is going to come from for himself or his children. We can do this. And yet, what do 147 heads of state and 195 negotiating parties do? They come together to talk about a non-problem. For there has been no global warming now for 18 years and 9 months, according to the RSS satellites. 18 years and 6 months, according to the UAE satellites. On all measures, the rate of warming since 1990 is well below even the least prediction then made by the United Nations Climate Panel in its first report. We know now there are defects in their equations, we know now there are mistakes in their models, and even if they were right about the science, they're wrong about the economics. It costs 10 to 100 times more to try to mitigate global warming today than simply to adapt to its adverse consequences the day after tomorrow, even if they were going to be as bad as we were told, which we now know they are not. So yes, we are doing the Lord's work. We do speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. And it is we and our voice here, careful, respectful, well-researched, that will and must, for their sake, carry the day. God bless you.